Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Musa and Sauda, and we're in with episode 3 of Big Talks because we hate small talk. So, we're going to jump straight into the topic, and basically, our topic for today is choosing what you believe and the importance of choosing what you believe.
So I'm just going to get right into the heart of it. Our last few talks were kind of on our beliefs and our journeys, and it brought me to two major questions that I would want to talk about over the course of this talk today. The first question was, why do people avoid talking about belief? Because I've noticed that people tend to avoid it, right? Especially from different beliefs specifically.
Right.
The second thing is, why is belief always associated with religion?
Right. And I've been doing a few different experimental posts on Facebook and Reddit and all this stuff to kind of dive into that topic a bit. And it's clearly there. There's clearly this subjective association that people will always equate belief or the word belief to religion.
Right.
So to get into these topics, I feel like first we need to define some terms, right? I think first, one term that we need to define is truth, because at the end of the day, the goal is to kind of align ourselves with truth, and then, of course, belief, right? So just to start off with truth, right? So if we look into the Oxford Dictionary, right? And I'm using Oxford Dictionary just because it's like an established definition. It's established. It has its reputation and all that stuff. So if you look at the Oxford Dictionary for truth, right? One of the definitions that you'll find is that which is in accordance with reality, right? But when we talk about truth here on Big Talks, we don't mean that which is with accordance to reality. We're literally talking about reality, right? So we're kind of separating the two.
Right.
I feel like that Oxford Dictionary definition is like a perfect example of this, because again, it's that which is in accordance with reality, but that's a subjective thing. So, because I guess I'll kind of explain it a bit. What we perceive to be reality might not necessarily be reality.
Right.
But our goal is to align our perception with what reality actually is.
Yeah, because to be honest with you, and I think this is something that it's really, really important for us to kind of mention and establish in the first few minutes, is there is a truth.
Right.
And that truth is objective, and that truth is the reality of this world.
Right.
Now, whether or not we obtain that, or we align ourselves with it, or we ever really truly perceive it, that's the subjective part.
Right. So
we're not talking, we're not talking about what we think is truth. Like, when we refer to the word truth, we actually mean the truth.
Right.
Whatever that is.
Right. And that's kind of why I wanted to pull that specific definition of the Oxford Dictionary, because I feel like that's what people take. And this is kind of where we're getting into what we're talking about belief, because this is going to segue into belief. When we talk about belief, it doesn't necessitate religion. We're talking about anything, right? If you take something as a fact, to some degree, you have to believe it, right? I mean, even if you look at the philosophical frameworks that are proposed for knowledge, it's one of which is a true justified belief. I've mentioned this before, but belief is still a part of the equation.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're trying to align our perception of reality with what is actually happening, it's going to require us to take on beliefs. Because in order for us to take something as a fact, we need to believe that it's true.
Right.
And we can't reach a way to justify something 100%.
And I think just belief, if we could simplify it, would be understanding or accepting, not really understanding, but accepting that something is true.
Right.
And again, a lot of the time when we use the word belief, we're not always talking about religion.
Right.
We did mention our religious journeys, because again, even though Big Talks is not necessarily a religious channel and we're not teaching about Islam, those are the lenses that we use.
Right.
You know, I mean, we've got different lenses. We all have our own personalities. There's the lenses of personality. There's the lenses of our nature, our nurture, and also what we choose to believe.
Right.
Some of those beliefs being religious, but not all those beliefs are religious.
Right.
And belief, again, is what we would like to define it as is the acceptance of something true.
Right.
That something is true. Sorry.
Right. I mean, like, even if you give an example to that, right? So we have scientific facts, right? And we know, or at least anyone who studies scientific facts and epistemology and all this stuff, what you understand is that science cannot lead to absolute truth, which is why it differentiates facts as scientific facts, not necessarily as absolute facts, right? Mm-hmm. So within the framework of science, it already accounts for this fact or this understanding, right? But if we apply this, right? So let's take the example of anything that's scientifically proven, so that the Earth rotates, right? There's a whole bunch of different layers behind that we need to kind of make a leap of faith in order to even accept it, right? In order to take that on as a belief, you need to make a few leaps to take it, right? Because for one, you yourself have not observed the Earth spinning. You can observe the effects, but to say that it's because the Earth is spinning, how do you know that?
Not only that, I mean, if you yourself observed it anyway, like if you were able to make it out to space and see the Earth rotating, that's still based on your perception of things.
Right, and human perception is very limited, right? So the human capabilities in and of themselves are very limited in capturing information. So the eyes can only capture certain levels of light. We can only hear certain frequencies. We can only smell certain things. You know, like everything has a scope in which it works in.
Everything has a cap.
Everything has a cap, right? So because of that, to some degree, there's a level of belief that your senses and your interpretation of your senses is true, right? So I feel like, I don't want to go too deep into that, but I feel like we really needed to start by establishing those things.
Okay.
Like kind of defining truth, defining belief, because these are the topics.
I agree, for sure. And, you know, especially because we did get some feedback about defining our terms.
Right.
When we were talking about it, we mentioned truth many times in our talks. The first few, we mentioned belief. And, you know, one of the feedbacks that I got was, hey, why don't you just go ahead and define those terms? You know,
Right.
let people know exactly what it is you're talking about.
Right, and you know, it's probably because me and you, we just talk, you know. We have been talking for years now, and we kind of already have an idea of each other's understanding of things. So when we're talking to each other, it's very easy for us to skip defining terms, but even if we talk to other people, it's very clear, and it's very clear to us in these conversations that sometimes terms need to be defined. So naturally, when talking to other people, we'll define our terms, right? Like if somebody's misunderstanding, like, no, this isn't what I mean by this, I mean this, in which case now we've established what it is and tried to clarify the understanding. But with us, between me and you, we're kind of already on the same page.
Yeah.
So it was really good advice.
Thank you.
Right. So I guess with
Shout out to Mr. Willers.
So I guess with that, I think we can just go ahead and start like getting into the topic, right? So choosing what you believe, and why is that even important?
So we kind of segued into this from our first two talks, which just had to do with the fact that what we chose to believe has impacted our overall way of viewing this world.
Right.
And what we accept as absolute truths.
Right.
Now, again, there is a limited perception that the human being has overall in terms of how we view the world and what we tend to accept as truth, which, again, kind of ties back into personality, which we're going to jump into sooner or later, inshallah.
Probably sooner.
Probably sooner than later, because it's just something we've been really studying a lot lately, and we think it might be beneficial to everyone listening.
Right.
But why is it important to really choose our beliefs? So I mentioned this concept in episode 2, which is, why do you believe what you believe? Now, the feedback, however, wasn't really what I was looking for. And it kind of brought me to this question that I even started this big talk with, which was, why do people seem afraid to talk about it? And why is it always associated with religion? Now, the religion aspect makes sense to me. I don't think it needs to always be associated with religion, which is why we defined what we mean when we use the word belief. Because if you're trying to define what you accept is true, that's going to push your decision making.
Right.
Regardless, right, of which religion you follow.
I mean, that in itself is a decision.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even choosing that belief is a decision, and then that belief dictates the rest of your decisions. And I mean, it's just something really important even when it comes to decision making. And I would say one of the reasons why it's so important to choose what you believe is for decision making.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, because again, we tend to look at the external stimuli and make decisions based on that, but that may not necessarily be what we accept as true.
Right. And sometimes we'll just make a decision without any justification.
Right.
You know, like when I was younger, going through middle school, high school, and all that stuff, and I mentioned this in my story, but I basically adopted atheism without really thinking about it.
Right.
I didn't have a reason to adopt atheism. It's more like I had a reason not to adopt something else, therefore I adopted it, but these two things don't equate.
Right.
You know, so this is something that I feel like happens a lot in people. They just take on some belief, and I mean, to some degree, perhaps it's just testimony. They hear it from somebody else, so they take it. Maybe they trust that person who is saying it, so they take it. But there's a whole bunch of different layers and levels as to whether that is something that you should actually take. And at the end of the day, you're responsible for your own decisions.
I mean, just because you haven't chosen something doesn't mean that you've chosen something else.
Right.
And, you know, there's this in-between that happens where you may not have chosen anything at all.
Right.
And you're kind of just going along with the tide, moving, being pushed by the wind, by the waves, by twigs in the water.
Right.
And you may think that you haven't chosen something, so you've chosen something else, but that's not necessarily the case.
Right. And, you know, that's why I kind of made that realization, and that's what pushed me to choose agnosticism, because when I was atheist, I was basically choosing something without any like real justifications. But when I analyzed it for myself, I realized I'm not choosing this based on anything solid. So what is the only position that I can take? At that point, the only position of not taking a position would be agnosticism. So that's how I ended up there.
Yeah. And, you know, it kind of brings me into thinking about just the different categories that people may fall into in general. I think that there are people who actively choose what they believe. And again, it's not fully religion. Religion does fall under that belief, but I'm talking about overall belief now, right? Some people actively choose what they believe, and they try to substantiate that belief.
Right.
Other people may choose what they believe but not substantiate that belief.
Right.
Other people may not choose what they believe at all and just follow.
Right.
Or some people may follow, they have some understanding of it, but they don't have that conviction in that belief.
Right. And I think these are like kind of like, these aren't really like really defined. You know, we're just kind of talking and kind of thinking about the different things here, but we could probably even narrow it down even further. Not that I'm going to, but I'm just saying, like, if we really wanted to narrow it down, some of these in-betweens can literally just be like a state in between. You know, there could be like some defined states and then some in-between states. And I feel like that's kind of what we're here, but
I mean, not only that, people move back and forth.
Right.
You know, they move back and forth, and life is not simple. It is, but it isn't.
Right.
And even just the understanding of choosing what you believe is not a simple thing.
Right.
Even in terms of believing what we're saying right now in this moment, right? So if you're listening to us talking right now, you have to choose whether you believe what we're saying or not.
Right.
And that belief doesn't have anything to do with religion. That belief has to do with whether or not you accept what we're saying as true.
Right. And the way that you would justify it could be different. You know, it could be based on your own personal experiences. It could be based on some knowledge that you have, some like concrete knowledge that that can be used as the foundation for that belief. But, you know, it's at the end of the day, we have to differentiate between that justification and that belief. Because belief is just accepting.
Yeah.
Now, on what grounds are you accepting something is something different.
Right. Which is where we bring in truth.
Right.
Because again, truth is reality. That's the definition that we're using. That's very broad. But overall, I mean, if we were simplifying it, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, okay, for example, what laws exist in the universe that even though we may not see, we may not understand, or we may not even know, they do exist, and they are laws because they fall into the category of a law of something, as how something is set to exist and function and maintain itself. Right? And you know, it makes me think about just the laws of physics, the laws of you know, whatever, science in general. But let me just talk about physics. Even those laws of physics that we think that we know are still based on our perceptions of the world. And the true laws of physics, right, the truth of the laws of physics may or may not be what we believe them to be.
Right. So for us, we are perceiving and assessing our perception of it, and the goal is to align that perception with the actual reality.
Right.
Now,
get as close as you can as possible.
Right. Now, whether or not we did or not is the question, right? So that's where we go ahead and we apply these things and we see if they actually work.
Yeah.
But before that, right, before that point where we got to the point of where we're ready to apply it to see if it actually works and we've adopted it as a truth that we're going to accept, to some degree you had to make a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And that's where the belief comes in.
Yeah.
Right? And you had to accept it, but you weren't 100% there.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't know for sure that this is an absolute truth.
Right. And you know, that poses the question of can you actually know anything 100%?
Right. Can you?
Right.
And that's a topic we've been talking about for a few days now. And I don't know. Personally, based on our human understanding, I don't think we can. I don't think there's anything that we can know 100%, because if we knew it 100%, that would mean that our knowledge is infinite.
And I mean, I think about it. If anyone has an opinion on this, we would love to hear about it.
Right.
And, you know, share it, drop it in the comment section or whatever, private message us. We are just really interested in this topic. It's like a hot topic with us right now. And it's something that we've been looking out for to see kind of how people respond to this notion of, can we actually ever know something 100%?
Right. And again, that's why I differentiate between our perception and what reality is and what truth actually is, right?
Right.
It's because that truth exists.
Yes.
You know, that truth exists, and whether or not we align ourselves with it is whatever. Now, you know, I kind of want to jump back to the other question that you had about why are people kind of afraid to talk about certain things, to talk about belief. I feel like to some degree that has to do with that leap of faith, right? So I feel like depending on the jump that you made, that leap and the gap of that leap determines whether you actually have grounds to justify it or not.
Right, because let's say you're someone who is, this is an exaggerated number, but like you said, but let's say you're someone who's at 99%.
Right.
You only have to take a 1% leap.
Right.
Feels easier.
In which case, if somebody asks you, well, why do you believe this?
Why do you believe what you believe? You're going to be like, all right, here, boom, 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 boom. This is why I believe what I believe.
You have 99% justification to apply and to give to that person. But let's say that you're somebody who only had like 20%.
Or less.
Or even less. You had to make like an 80% or more leap in order to get to that point. And then when somebody asks you, well, why is it that you believe what you believe? You're not nearly as confident in that justification.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that is what happens. And this, again, this does not only apply to belief in religion. This can apply to knowledge in science, social studies, anything, knowledge in anything.
I mean, even in the workplace,
right?
Where you believe something about someone else,
right? With people, with things. Like one example, science, right? So have you ever? We've taught, right? Me and my wife have taught kids, and we've done a lot of things. And one thing we like to make sure is that the person understands why things are the way they are. Don't just regurgitate the information to me. I need to see that you actually understand it. And I think that's an explanation of that gap. So when you regurgitate something, you kind of jump from whatever level of understanding you had. Like if it's like 2 or 5%, you've made a jump to 100%, and you're regurgitating it, right? And I'm saying regurgitate, but you're telling that thing, right?
That's fine.
But if you didn't understand it and I go back and I tell you, explain it to me, and you only had 5% understanding of this, suddenly you don't feel confident, right? Like you don't have any confidence in this, and you're second guessing yourself and all this stuff.
This is what happens to our students overall, because again, they don't learn to understand.
No, they just learn to repeat.
They learn to remember.
Right, remember it and repeat. But then when you go in and you're like, well, look, you've been saying this for so long that you've now become like you now believe it, you've now adopted it, and honestly that's kind of what school is. They tell you a bunch of things and then you just believe it, and then later on in life when you need to apply it, you don't know how because you don't understand it.
Critical thinking is a lost skill.
Yeah, it is a lost skill.
And that was a very good example of what happens to people overall.
Right.
Because again, you are a kid, you're in school, you're told, listen, here is the information, and you're going to have a test. You need to repeat back this information to me, like, for example, standardized testing,
right?
Which is coming up in a few days, so I can imagine everyone is stressed right now. So you have the standardized testing, or you've got regular testing, whatever. And they just have to repeat the information, and then you ask them later on. Let's say someone just comes out, like an atypical teacher, like you and me, and we say, well, outside of what you're supposed to regurgitate or repeat back to us, why is this happening? Explain this to me. How is this happening? Right. What happens if this happens, then this happens? What happens then?
What is the
those kinds of questions, right? Which at that point they're lost, and like you said, they lose their confidence. They might have a slight idea of something, however, they're not able to truly justify it in terms of the world that we live in, right? Because again, justification itself is something complicated. But let's just say in the simpler sense of the word justification, just explaining it, right? Making sure it's reasonable.
Right.
They don't know.
Right.
And that was a very good analogy to the average person who has chosen a belief.
Right. And, that's kind of why I went that path.
Yeah.
It's because today science is seen as the route to knowledge, right? People would subjectively consider science how we learn, right? But it's not the only way that we learn, but it does provide a pretty good example of what we're talking about here. And it's outside of the realm of religion. It's outside of the realm of belief. Actually, scientists go very far to make sure that the concept of God does not enter science. So we know that this is isolated from belief and religious belief in that sense, but to some degree you still need belief to even do science.
I mean, yeah, they negate God in science, however you still have belief in science. Belief does not exit itself from any aspect of life,
right? And I would argue that belief is a necessity for humanity to even take on anything as truth. And it's like fundamental to our existence, because at the end of the day, if you don't take anything to be true, how do you live?
Think about it like this. I just thought of an example of something that we heard a while back. I don't remember the exact example, but this is bringing me to this thought of inventing things. And so before we invent something, we tend to try it out and test it out. And we know that the scientific method does, of course, promote retesting just to validate your results.
Right.
So let's say I tested something. Let's say I'm going to build something simple like a table. So I first test out how I think I can actually get this table to stand properly. You know, I have the right mathematical, dimensions or whatever. And I have everything, and I understand like the physics of how this is going to work. And I've tested it out. I've made a few, you know, before I go for like the big guns. But right before I get to that point, I still have to believe that every single time that I tested it, let's say I tested it 200 times, I have to believe that the 201st time that I'm going to do this, it's going to happen the same exact way.
Right. And I actually like that example a lot. To some degree, I mean, that's just how we go by life, you know?
Yeah.
When we see a pattern, we take that pattern as a truth.
Yeah.
You know, and the next time we run into that pattern, we're taking a belief that it's going to occur that way. Mm-hmm. And I remember what you were talking about. I think the example that the person gave,
it was in some religious debate thing.
Yeah, it was Hamza. He was talking about how when you flip a coin, and he was giving this really crazy example, but this was the exact example. He said, if you flip a coin and it turns into a butterfly, right? And then you do this 100 times, and every time you flip this coin, it turns into a butterfly. Eventually, you're going to adopt the belief that if you flip a coin, it turns into a butterfly. Mm-hmm. Now, from that point on, you're going to believe that every time I flip this coin, it's going to become a butterfly. But what happens the 1001th time if you flip the coin and it doesn't become a butterfly? Now what?
Your belief is shattered.
Your belief is shattered, right? So was it true? Not necessarily. Something changed here in this equation that made it not true. But human perception is so limited that we rely on belief to move forward.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, just anything that we do, any habits that we make, any you know, even just getting into your car to drive somewhere,
right,
is you're believing that this thing is going to work the way that it has worked all the 3,000 times that you've driven it so far.
Right.
You know?
And, you know, a lot of people will just argue that you can get by in life without belief. Like you don't need that 1%. You don't need that extra jump. You can just take it as as not a certain fact, but like a most likely fact, and you'll be fine. But I feel like people just don't realize that in order to take it as a fact, you have to make a leap of faith.
It has to be accepted.
Right. You have to accept it, right?
Right. If it's not accepted, if it's not truly accepted, it's not taken as a truth. That's
right.
all.
I mean, again, if you fall back on knowledge is a true justified belief. If you don't take it as a belief, it's not knowledge.
Yeah, and I mean, getting through life like that would just be really, really stressful. You'd probably just be this skeptic shut-in who doesn't do anything but sit in one spot because at any point anything could happen.
Right.
And yeah, you know, that's not really how life works.
Right. And just again, the point of this whole section of the talk is kind of just establish what we're talking about. We're establishing belief, or the understanding of belief. We're establishing the understanding of truth, and the fact that it doesn't necessitate that belief applies only to religion. Mm-hmm. However, we can apply it to religion, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
This is where we can kind of turn the conversation a bit, right? And this is even where the root of the problem even came from, because you're talking to people, we're talking to people, and people just don't want to talk about their beliefs.
Right.
And in most senses, when we say belief, it falls into a religious, it falls into the court of religion.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, that's understandable, but it's not restricted to religion is the point that we wanted to establish. But now we can go ahead and talk about religion, because it's very common that we will talk about religion, even across different religions. We'll have this conversation, and some people just avoid the topic altogether.
I mean, I think it's also just kind of impossible for us to have these talks to begin with, right, without using Islam at all.
Right. And you know, that's something that we have, me and you, we have this belief, and we've taken Islam as absolute fact, right? This is what it is. We've made the leap of faith, but we have like I won't put a number to it, but I would say we have a high justification for making that leap of faith, which is why we're confident in our ability to talk to other people about religion.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't. They just make the leap of faith because maybe they
don't know anything else.
They don't know anything else. They grew up, and that's the context in which they grew up in. They grew up in a Christian household, in a Muslim household, in a Hindu household, whatever religion it is. If you grew up in that, but you never actually chose the religion for yourself, and to choose something for yourself to some degree is going to require some justification.
You need to accept it as your truth.
Right. Can you make the blind faith and go from 1% to 100% and that actually be a choice? Sure. But then it's a weak it's weak.
It's a weak choice.
It's a weak choice.
It's become weak, yeah.
It's a weak choice, and then when somebody comes and asks you, well, what about this? Or they bring up information that contradicts your religion, and this happens all the time, like especially with Muslims, where Muslims are like, this scientific understanding, the Quran says this, and this scientific understanding says this, it contradicts, and suddenly they're jumping ship and they're leaving Islam. It's that we're talking about. They didn't have the justification to begin with on their decision to believe in Islam. Right. And that's what made their faith weak.
But I just want to put out there, though, that this does not mean that someone who was born into an Islamic household or any other household cannot choose that at some point.
Right.
Like, we're not trying to say that you have to go out and experience a bunch of different things, or you have to be coming in from some other aspect of life. Like, you can make your choice at any point in your life, in any walk of life. And
based on any justification, honestly.
Right, So, I mean, there are some Muslims who probably grew up in a Muslim household. They didn't really know anything else. They may not have left Islam or deviated or rebelled in any way.
Right.
But they've chosen that. They understand it with that depth in their heart. And they've taken that, that 1% or however much, wherever they got to, right? And they accept that as the truth.
Right. And
I just wanted to add that in there because I don't want it to sound like we're saying that those who were born into it can't accept it or choose it for themselves.
Right. I mean, again, that's differentiating between the percentages, right? So you may have reached 20%, but you made the active choice to make the 80% leap. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's the importance of making the active choice to choose what you believe.
Right.
We're talking about all this other context that kind of goes into this. However, the topic is the importance of choosing what you believe.
Yes, because again, you need to be confident in that belief.
Right. And I would argue that it's a lot better to have a justified belief than to just make a leap of faith. Because at the end of the day, if somebody comes up to you and they challenge you, what do?
Yeah.
Somebody can corner you intellectually and just challenge your belief, and then when you don't have an answer, now you're doubting yourself. Now you're doubting your choice. And when you have to doubt your choice, that just shows the weakness in that faith. That shows the weakness in that belief to begin with. And at least for me and you, I feel like we don't have that, because even within Islam teaches you to seek knowledge.
Yes.
Right.
Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave.
And it teaches you to seek knowledge, and it also teaches you to use Islam as the foundation of absolute truth. And when you actually do that, what you end up finding, at least in our experience, is there's no doubting it. Like, to this point, 3 years in, I've been studying Islam. I've been studying a whole bunch of things. I'm not the type to just study one
we
thing.
Don't limit ourselves to just studying Islamic studies. I mean, we study philosophy, we study biology, we study psychology. I'm studying business.
Right. We're studying all different walks or different topics of life, which is why we have such a wide variety of things to talk about. But the one thing that I've always found, at least within Islam, is you cannot nullify Islam. And I think that's the important thing. It's because we have no grounds to justify things absolutely, right? I mean, that's the point of science. Science can't take things to an absolute level. It can only take it to a highly justified level, which is why we differentiate between scientific fact and an absolute fact.
Yeah.
Right? Math gets a little closer. I can even argue that perhaps it does get all the way. Math probably has the ability to prove absolute facts. The problem is our human perception is determining the values we put into the equation. So even though math is capable of doing it, are we capable of using math to that degree?
I would say math itself is an absolute truth.
Right. I would also argue that math is an absolute truth. Now, our ability to use that absolute truth is the question.
Well, that's subjective.
But the point is, we as human beings do not have a means to prove something absolutely. Right? So what do we fall back on? We fall back on falsification. Right? So just like in science, the process is to do the experiment. If at any point somebody disproves the experiment, it's been falsified. Right? Now we can take it as a non-belief. We can take it to 0%. We can't take it to 100%, but we can take it to 0%. What I found in Islam is there's nothing that can take Islamic belief in the core values of Islam to 0%.
Okay.
I haven't found it. Even the existence of God, right? And we've brought this up a few times, and we've openly declared you cannot disprove the existence of God, and I would challenge anybody to try, because at the end of the day, you can't. There's nothing that you can say that proves that God does not exist.
Right. I mean, I've gotten some feedback on that one, specifically about atheism and why it exists and such. And, you know, looking into it, it's all subjective.
Right.
It's all subjective, and it falls back to desires. It falls back to what they hold as their belief, what they accept as true, or what's the word? It comes back to that floating position that we were talking about, where they'll negate something just because, or they'll accept something, just because they've negated something else.
Right.
And that's not really the case. Like, that's not the reality of the world. Even though you may have negated it for your own subjective reasons, that doesn't mean that accepting something else just suddenly comes into play and it suddenly is applied.
Right. And then you even have to question whether it's actually been nullified, you know? Like,
well, negated to them, I mean. I don't mean truly negated.
Right. Was it objectively negated or was it subjectively negated?
I haven't found any objective reasons.
Right. And I think that's like a very important thing to clarify. We're not talking subjective. We're not talking subjective reasons, because there's a lot of people, and this is an experience that I've heard from a few different people who get into dawah and teaching and trying to spread Islam and stuff. They find that the reason why some people don't believe in God has nothing to do with objective reality. It has something to do with a personal experience that they fell into, right? Like, take Hitler. Adolf Hitler, we know Adolf Hitler was probably one of the worst human beings to ever exist. Supposedly. But he used to believe in God. If you look into his history, he believed in God up to the point that his younger brother died. And when his younger brother died, people around him talk about, or the people who were there, they testified to this change that occurred in Adolf Hitler, where he stopped believing in God. He would be at the graveyard just kind of sitting there for hours on end, for days at a time after the death of his brother. And from that point on, he didn't believe in God anymore. And was this decision to not believe in God based on an objective reality? It seems like, at least in this case, and of course we can't prove this because we're not talking to Adolf Hitler, but the evidence seems to point to the fact that he didn't believe in God anymore based on the fact that his brother died.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. That doesn't objectively disprove God's existence.
I mean, I don't see how death at all disproves it.
Right. When you look at it objectively, it can't disprove the existence of God. And that's kind of what I mean. Like, any reason that you might come up with to say that God doesn't exist, you have to critically challenge that reason objectively.
I mean, yeah, and drop a comment if, there's any atheists out there listening. I'm truly interested in finding just anyone that can give any type of objective reasonings.
Right. And
Go ahead.
This is the going back into that question, right? Like, we're kind of giving an example of what we mean when we talk about having a certain level of strong belief in or like strength in your belief, like conviction in your belief, as opposed to people who don't. That question where it's like, why do people not want to talk about belief?
Okay.
We don't mind talking about these things because we've gotten to a point in our belief and justification of our belief that we feel strong about, and at the same time nothing has nullified it yet. And I think that is what we're trying to at least give by example.
Right.
Like, and I'm going to use Christianity as the example. Some Christians, you'll talk to them and you ask them, well, why do you believe what they believe? And they don't know. And if you were to throw something like, okay, well, let's take two versions of the Bible and talk about how there's a discrepancy in the details, right? This person is saying this one, or this version of the Bible says this version of the Bible says that. How can you explain this? And then suddenly they're faced with an objective reality, which is that these two books say something different, but it's still the core of the religion. So now the validity of the religion is under question, and that can completely ruin someone's faith.
Right.
You know, and it's these kind of realities that you need to look at objectively. But for us, at least as Muslims, we don't have, or we haven't found that reality.
Yeah, but it also requires you to actually seek that reality.
Right.
You know, and it's something that I was thinking about is, I'm not trying to say that just because you're a Muslim or you call yourself a Muslim, right? You refer to yourself as a Muslim. That doesn't mean that you've sought the truth.
Right.
You know, and I think that's just a very important point that needs to be put out, at this point in the talk when we're referring to Christianity, because there are Christians who may be actively seeking the truth.
Right.
And this is not to put down the Christian person or to put up the Muslim person, because regardless of what walk of life you're in, that does not necessitate that you as an individual have sought the truth.
Yeah.
You know, so this is not to say, well, we believe Islam is the truth, right? So I'm going to sit here and say, I believe Islam is the truth. I am not stating that every Muslim has sought the truth because they call themselves a Muslim.
Right.
So they submit to the will of Allah or Islam, you know? That's not the case at all. And that's one reason why it's so important to choose what you believe.
Right.
You know, because when you can say, yes, I chose what I believe, that means that you were seeking truth. Right. Now, whether or not you aligned yourself with the objective truth of the world is a different story.
Right. Or whether you even have the justification to do it, again, because you could have had a 20% justification and made an 80% leap. Mm-hmm. You know, it's better to seek higher justification.
Right.
Right. And that's kind of why, at least in our religion, we're taught to seek knowledge. Mm-hmm. The more knowledge you have, they say that knowledge is power. Well, what is that power? Right. That power could be, you could look at it in terms of application. Mm-hmm. Right. You could look at it as terms
the power
of what
of
it's
choice.
Right. But that I think that's what it actually leads to. Mm-hmm. Is knowledge gives you power to choice, because at the end of the day, what can we ourselves do? Mm-hmm. Right? Our body runs themselves. It's not like we're sitting here actively pumping our blood, or that we're sitting here actively blinking at times. Sometimes we can take control of the act of blinking. Yeah. But do we even control the motors that of which is making the eyelid close?
What do we have the ability to do?
The only thing that we have the ability to do is to choose. That's it. That's the only thing that we can actually do, is to make a choice. Mm-hmm. And that's why in the previous talk we were talking about how life is a series of choices, because at the end of the day, what else can you do? All you can do is make a choice. And it's important to choose what you believe because of that. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that you can actually do. You don't even control the lens that you see the world through oftentimes. The only one that you control are the choices that you made. Mm-hmm. But as far as like what you're born with, like MBTI, for example, right? So MBTI is personality. It's divided into 16 categories and stuff. And there's different ways of understanding MBTI, and I think a lot of people like to take personality and look at the results of personality. Mm-hmm. But it's not really about the results, it's about the lens, right? Each of these functions that MBTI provides as a framework to understand yourself is a function, and these are like physical wirings.
Right,
like,
it has to do with our cognition.
Right, so your brain is physically wired in a way to express itself, like, and we can get into biology if we wanted to, but basically there's a certain arrangement of the cells or a certain arrangement of atom in you that results in a certain expression, and that expression is the functions. Yeah. Right, so introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, sensing, intuition, all these things are like physical wirings. And how you intake information, that's the lens.
Right.
So these are going to determine, these lenses that we have are going to determine how we intake information. And of course, that's going to influence how you make your choice.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily influence the choice itself.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, you still need to make a choice. The power is in your hands. The information you got and the way you got it is one thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I see MBTI being really important for. It's for understanding the lens of yourself and how you intake information. Because when you can align yourself with those lenses, everything gets so much easier.
That's true. That's true. So yeah, guys, basically choosing your belief, again, it literally comes down to the power of choice.
Right.
And the power of choice is the greatest thing that we can hold as human beings in our limited scope of being human beings.
Right.
It's the only thing that we've truly been given to do. I mean,
right.
We've given a lot of things, but what we can do with it, is make a choice.
Right.
And when you are wavering in your belief, which is whatever you accept to be true, regardless of what that is, your decision making now can also start to waver.
Right.
Your confidence wavers. Your ability to stand up for what you believe wavers.
Right.
Your likelihood to run away from situations increases.
Right. And the reason why I would say it is doing that is because of the justification.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're likely not justified enough to make that leap of faith.
Yeah.
So now you have to question it.
Yeah. All right, so I guess we'll end there, and we will let you guys roll over this information in your minds. Again, I really do welcome feedback. I would love to hear from you guys in the comments, or even, again, private messaging if you're someone who just isn't comfortable with talking about these things out there and open for people to kind of hear your thoughts. Send us private messages, and we do invest time into these kinds of things and deep conversations.
Right.
I'm always messaging people all the time, even though people may feel that I don't message at all. But one of the reasons why is because of the amount of people that I'm reaching out to on a daily basis, and I don't mind. I think as long as it feels worth it to me, if it's something that I believe in,
Right.
I'll definitely do it. So we really hope that you guys enjoyed this podcast or this Big Talks. And, Musa kind of introduced MBTI a little bit, and it's something that we're going to hopefully jump into very soon. Just overall, when we think about choosing our beliefs, again, there's another layer to choosing our beliefs that exist, which is how did we even get to the point of choosing that belief?
Right.
And that has a lot to do with our cognitive functions, our lenses to the world.
Right.
So the lenses of reality, the lenses of the world, the lenses of life is something that we are going to jump into, inshallah, and we really hope that you guys will enjoy that when we get to that point.
All right.
All right, so thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.